Because, come on, who doesn't have a weakness for members of ancient noble families who have excellent manners and who know how to invite a woman out for a lovely evening? If they happen to be gorgeous as well, I'm open-minded. I won't hold that against them. Michele met me at the Duomo one soft summer evening, just as the stars were coming out. The piazza was littered with the perfect number of strolling Italians and drunken Englishmen, and the street lamps were just far enough apart to shed the ideal amber glow on the golden buildings. Even Michele's walk was aristocratic. He had told me he came from a very old family, but that meant nothing to me until I saw his hips. They told me everything. Once upon a time, I used to go to school with princes and princesses and noble scions and heirs to super fortunes. These people have a particular way of moving that I recognized in Michele. In his hips was the casualness of someone whose family had not just lived in the land for centuries, but had owned a good chunk of it too, and probably still did. There is a grace to the well-rooted alpha, and a feral certainty that only a lifetime of power emerging from centuries of earlier power can bring. Finally, I stopped looking at the walk and looked at the man himself, and my jaw dropped. God was unfair in such a great way. I wanted to strip right there. Instead, Michele fastened me into my helmet, and we hopped onto his scarlet Bugatti. Motorcycles were invented so that men could get women to wrap their thighs around them and hold tight, to press their boobs against them and wrap their arms around their abdomens and clasp themselves to them, as every throb of the motor and pulsation of the man's muscles passes through the couple. We zipped through the alleys like ninjas. He showed me Renaissance churches, medieval leftovers, the lights on the Ponte Vecchio twinkling into the river, flowing below. But I did not pay nearly as much attention as I ought to have done, because, you see, I had already seen Renaissance churches. I had already seen piazze, and I had already been to Florence. But this living, breathing animal pressed up against my body. This was new and alive. This was a real human happening right now, just for me. My hands were fascinated by how his abs responded to tiny changes in direction, continually flowing and shifting with the traffic. I reminded myself that it was bad to go fast on motorcycles, to weave through traffic, and to take the lights as suggestions, but I was tired of being good all the time. Why not let myself admit that the ride was thrilling? I loved feeling the rumply road and the living engine underneath me. I felt connected with everything. He took me to Fiesole, and we looked out from a mountainside vista to the city lights twinkling below. Dark cypresses framed our view, and just the right amount of stars shone above the domes and steeples and terracotta roofs. The zephyr caressed us from time to time. We leaned on a wall, and he listened to whatever I had to say. He was unrushed. No cell phone, no need to get anywhere, no need to do anything. And he seemed fascinated by me. I love it when someone listens to me. It's so sexy. It's so delicious when someone takes the time to listen. It was hard to talk, though, because he was so attractive, standing there, listening to me, the breeze wafting through his fabulous hair. He was standing close enough to be intimate, but in a non-threatening way. He told me just enough about himself to be interesting and open without commandeering the conversation. He used to be a lawyer, but he quit, and now he organizes sporting events. After having been around so many people who didn't want to do anything, I loved watching Michele smile as he talked about his work. I asked him about his family. The Morellini had lived in Florence for over 2,000 years. They are also genealogy buffs, so the family tree is documented, and they have also always been among the powerful caste, which explained Michele's walk. He laughed a little when he said, Dante put my great-great-great-whatever grandma in hell. Signora Morellini bought Dante's house when he was exiled from Florence, so to get back at her, he listed her name in the Inferno. And there she remains to this day, suffering in damnation for all eternity. Michele belonged to Florence. They looked like they were one thing, made of the same clay. There was no gap where he ended and the land started. I saw how restful life could be this way. When I looked at him, I saw that this was how most of us used to live all over the world, except for pirates. Towns used to be different when everyone was really from somewhere, when the normal state of affairs was that if you were from a certain family, your people had lived in a certain place forever. No wonder foreigners and visitors were viewed as exotic. Michele and I spoke in the unrushed way of friends, so much so that I started to wonder, maybe he just wanted to be friends. The uncertainty added spice. By midnight I was ravenous. We headed back into town and found a place where they let us eat in a parking spot next to a couple of women who were doing the same. They brought out a table and chairs and we watched the passers-by, even though it was literally the middle of the night. We ate pizza and salad and drank Chianti, and he showed me about putting olive oil on the pizza. He told me the history of the different regions of Italy, how they had been separate places until recently, and how the different dialects are more different from one another than Italian is different from Spanish or French, and that if he listened to someone from Venice or Sicily talking until quite recently, he would have had no idea what they were saying. And I loved that. I want local dialects to survive. He took me back to my host's place, which made me sad. Why couldn't he take me back to his place? How could anyone not want to have sex with me? Perhaps he placed an appropriately high value on sex and did not throw it around lightly. Perhaps he understood that human beings had feelings and that sex changes things and is not to be undertaken lightly. Or perhaps he just saw me as a friend and wasn't interested in anything more. But when I lit from his motorcycle, I leaned up to him, just like in a story, to dispense the official social hug cheek back good night. And without any hesitation, he kissed me goodnight. And it was one of the top 3 kisses ever. Soft, slow, luscious. His kiss disappeared around the edges. The beating heart of the kiss expanded and dissolved into the essence of the human soul. I craved his kiss. I wanted to plaster myself all over him and shove my tongue down his throat and have my wicked way with him all day long. But I also did not want to scare him or assume privileges that maybe he did not want to extend to me. So I listened carefully, trying not to violate his maidenly virtue. But once we started kissing, we could not stop. With each kiss, we revealed a bit more. I allowed my hand to run through his soft, silky, lustrous hair, and I held his head and he let me, even though it was a gesture of ownership. His kiss exuded romance. But as it evolved and he started to feel safe around a new person, it also glowed with the desires of the lower chakras. Eventually, we reached the point in our mutual truth-telling where either we would have to go to bed together and not sleep all night long, and probably most of the next day, or 2 days, or 3 days, and plans would change, and feelings would be felt, and vulnerability would happen. Or we would have to extricate our tongues from each other's mouths and go to bed like good little doobies. He went for the second option. I suspect he may not have wanted a one-night stand with someone just passing through. On the other hand, someone who looked like that and had that resume probably had someone at home. I like to think it would have meant something between us. Lives would have had to have been reassessed. Adjustments would have had to have been made. And when our lips finally parted, still burgeoning with the desire that draws men and women together and overpopulates the world, he looked me full in the eyes and kissed me with his voice when he said, "Ciao bella," which has been said a bajillion times before and will be said a bajillion times in the future. But it was like the first time anyone had said it. His whole self was in each word. I'd never heard anyone speak with such wistfulness before. I wrote to Michele later from Lausanne. He invited me back to Florence, spelling out the promise of long fingers and a warm tongue. So clearly, he didn't see me as just a friend. He offered to put me up, and then suddenly I heard nothing. And then it was I would have to find my own place to stay. And this made no sense to me at all, because what's the point of going back to a city to have sex with a guy if he's not going to provide you with a roof over his head? So I stayed with Fabio instead.